The city never really slept, but it changed after midnight, like it exhaled something it had been holding in all day, something heavy and sour that drifted through the streets once the last trains rattled into silence and the office lights blinked out one by one. And if you were still awake at that hour, truly awake, not just scrolling or numbing yourself with noise, you could feel it, a quiet shift, as though the buildings leaned just a little closer together, as though the streets stretched a little longer than they had before, as though something unseen had slipped into the empty spaces people left behind. Adrian noticed it first on a Tuesday night, though later he wouldn't be sure why that detail mattered, only that it did, like a loose thread in a dream you can't quite pull free because Tuesday was ordinary, forgettable, the kind of day that shouldn't carry weight. But it did, because that was the night he stayed out too late, missing the last metro by seconds as the doors slid shut in front of him. The driver not even looking up as Adrian tapped on the glass, breath fogging the window, until the train pulled away and left him alone on the platform with the flickering fluorescent lights and the hollow echo of his own footsteps. He could have called a taxi, of course, or waited for the early morning buses, but something in him resisted the idea of waiting, of sitting still in that stale underground air. So he climbed the stairs back to street level, pushing through the heavy door and into the city night, where the air felt colder than it should have for early autumn, biting at his cheeks, carrying a faint metallic tang that made him wrinkle his nose. The streets were not empty, not completely, but they were wrong, in the way a familiar room feels wrong when a single object has been moved, even if you can't immediately tell what it is, because the neon signs still buzzed and flickered above shuttered storefronts, and distant traffic hummed like a restless animal, and somewhere far off a siren wailed, stretching thin and ghostly between the buildings. But there were fewer people than there should have been, fewer cars, fewer lights in the windows, as if entire sections of the city had quietly decided to stop participating in the night. Adrian shoved his hands into his pockets and started walking, telling himself it wasn't a long distance, just a few kilometers, something he'd done before during late nights out with friends. But this time there were no friends, no laughter, no shared warmth to anchor him to reality. Only the steady rhythm of his own footsteps and the growing sense that the city was watching him, not in any literal way, he wasn't that paranoid, but in the subtle, creeping sense that something about the environment had shifted its attention toward him, like a crowd falling silent when you enter a room. At first he ignored it, focusing instead on the practical details of his route, the turns he needed to take, the landmarks he recognized, the convenience store on the corner with its bright white lights spilling onto the sidewalk. But when he reached it, he noticed the lights were on, and yet the door was locked, the glass reflecting his own confused face back at him, and inside, the shelves were stocked, the refrigerator units humming softly, but there was no clerk behind the counter, no movement at all, as if the place had been abandoned mid-shift, frozen in time. He knocked lightly on the glass, then harder, the sound dull and swallowed by the night. But no one came, and after a moment he stepped back, feeling a prickle of unease crawl up his spine, because it wasn't just that the store was empty. It was that it felt deliberately empty, as though whatever had been there had chosen to leave just before he arrived. He laughed softly to himself, a weak attempt to shake off the feeling, and continued walking. But now he was more aware of the silence between sounds, the gaps where something should have been but wasn't, and he began to notice other things too, small inconsistencies that didn't quite add up, like the traffic lights that changed from red to green to red again, even though there were no cars waiting, or the pedestrian crossing signals that blinked in patterns that didn't match the usual timing, or the windows in apartment buildings where televisions flickered with static instead of actual programs. It was subtle at first, easy to dismiss, but it accumulated detail by detail, until the city felt less like a place and more like a stage set, something constructed to resemble reality without fully understanding it. By the time Adrian reached the long stretch of road that led toward his neighborhood, he realized he hadn't seen another person in several minutes, not a single pedestrian, not even someone across the street. And the absence felt heavier than any presence could have, pressing in on him from all sides, making his footsteps sound too loud, too isolated. He quickened his pace, telling himself it was nothing, just a quiet night, just bad timing. But then he heard it. A second set of footsteps, faint but distinct, echoing just a fraction of a second after his own. He stopped. The echo stopped. He started walking again, slower this time, listening carefully, and there it was again. That slight delay, as if someone were following him, but always just out of sync, always matching his movements with a lag that made it impossible to pinpoint their exact location. He glanced over his shoulder, scanning the empty street, the darkened storefronts, the shadowed alleys, but saw nothing, and yet the feeling persisted, growing stronger with each step, until it was no longer something he could ignore. "Hello?" he called out, his voice sounding small and misplaced in the open space, swallowed by the buildings. No answer came, but the footsteps continued just behind his own, just out of reach. He broke into a jog, his heart beginning to pound, and the footsteps followed, still delayed, still mimicking him, not gaining, not falling behind, just there. The road ahead seemed longer than he remembered, stretching into the distance in a way that didn't make sense, the street lights repeating in an almost hypnotic pattern, each one casting a pool of pale light surrounded by deep shadow. And for a moment he had the strange, disorienting thought that he wasn't actually moving forward at all, that he was stuck in place while the city rearranged itself around him. He shook his head, trying to clear it, and that was when he saw the figures standing under the next street light. It was a person, at least it looked like one at first glance, but something about the proportions was off, the posture too rigid, the head tilted at an unnatural angle, and as Adrian slowed, the figure did not move. did not react, did not even seem to breathe. "Hey," Adrian said cautiously, approaching a few steps closer, but as he did, he noticed something that made his stomach drop. The figure was facing away from him, and yet its head was turned completely around, looking directly at him with eyes that reflected the streetlight in a way that didn't look like eyes at all, more like glass or polished metal. Adrian froze, every instinct screaming at him to run, but his body refused to obey, locked in place by a paralyzing mix of fear and disbelief. And then the figure moved, not stepping forward, not turning its body, but simply shifting, like a glitch in reality, appearing suddenly closer than it had been a moment before, its limbs bending at angles that shouldn't have been possible, its head still fixed on him. The delayed footsteps behind Adrian stopped. For a moment, everything was silent. And then, from somewhere very close, too close, he heard his own voice perfectly mimicked, whispering from just behind his ear, "Don't turn around." Adrian didn't breathe, didn't blink, didn't dare to move a single muscle as the whisper settled into the space around him like something alive, something that didn't belong to him anymore, because he knew that voice. It was his, every tone and inflection perfectly replicated, but there was something underneath it, something hollow and stretched thin, like a recording played back through a broken speaker. And the worst part was not the voice itself, but the certainty that it had not come from his own mouth. The figure under the streetlight twitched again, its movements snapping from one position to another without transition, like frames missing from a film. And Adrian felt a cold pressure build behind his eyes, as though reality itself were stuttering. "Don't turn around," the voice repeated, closer now, almost brushing against his ear, and instinctively, stupidly, he obeyed, his gaze locked forward on the impossible thing in front of him, because somehow that felt safer than acknowledging whatever stood behind him. The street light above flickered once, twice, and then steadied, but the shadows around it seemed deeper than before, thicker, as if they had weight. And Adrian became painfully aware that the city was no longer just quiet. It was listening. The figure took another step, or perhaps it didn't step at all, but simply appeared closer again, its limbs reconfiguring in that same unnatural way, joints bending where no joint should exist, until it stood just at the edge of the light, where its features became clearer and yet less comprehensible, its face smooth in places and fractured in others, like multiple expressions layered on top of each other and failing to align. Adrian's heart pounded so hard it hurt, each beat echoing in his ears, drowning out everything else, and for a moment he thought that might save him, that the noise of his own body would block out whatever was happening. But then the sound of his heartbeat began to echo too, just like his footsteps had, a second rhythm overlapping the first, slightly delayed, slightly wrong. Behind him, something shifted, not footsteps this time, but a presence, a change in the air, like someone leaning in closer, and he felt the faintest brush against the back of his jacket, as though Invisible fingers were testing the fabric, learning its texture. "You missed it," his voice whispered again, and this time it sounded almost amused, almost curious. "The last train. You weren't supposed to stay." Adrian swallowed hard, his throat dry, and forced himself to speak, his own voice trembling. What do you want?" For a moment there was no answer, and then the figure in front of him tilted its head further, impossibly further, until it seemed like it might snap. And when it spoke, the sound came from everywhere at once, layered and distorted, overlapping with the whisper behind him. "You're still here." The words didn't make sense, not entirely, but they carried a weight that pressed into him, as though they were stating a fact that shouldn't be true, as though his very presence was an error. The city around him seemed to respond, the distant hum of traffic fading even further until it was almost gone, the neon lights dimming, the windows going dark one by one, like something was systematically shutting the world down. Adrian's chest tightened with panic, and this time his body listened. He turned and ran. The moment he moved, the thing behind him reacted, its presence snapping into motion with that same unnatural, delayed rhythm, and the sound of his own footsteps multiplied, echoing out of sync, filling the street with a chaotic pattern that made it impossible to tell where anything actually was. He didn't look back, couldn't look back, because he knew that if he saw it, if he confirmed it, something irreversible would happen. The road stretched ahead of him again, longer than it should have been, the street lights repeating endlessly, and his lungs burned as he ran, his breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps that fogged the cold air. He turned a corner, one he recognized, one that should have led toward his apartment, and skidded to a stop. The street was wrong. It looked like his street, the same buildings, the same layout, but the details were off, subtly distorted, like a copy made from memory rather than reality. And every window was dark, every door closed, every surface just slightly misaligned. Behind him, the footsteps stopped. Silence fell again, heavy and absolute. Slowly, against every instinct, Adrian turned his head just enough to glance over his shoulder. The street behind him was empty. Completely, impossibly empty. No figure under the streetlight, no presence in the shadows, nothing. For a brief, fragile moment, relief flickered through him, weak but real, and he let out a shaky breath, his shoulders sagging as the tension began to drain away. "Okay," he muttered to himself, his voice unsteady. "Okay, it's gone." "No," his voice said gently, right in front of him. Adrian's head snapped forward. Standing less than a meter away was himself. Not a reflection, not a trick of light. Him, down to every detail, every crease in his jacket, every strand of hair out of place, but wrong in the same way everything else was wrong. His expression fixed in a smile that didn't quite reach the eyes. His posture too still, too precise, like a mannequin trying to imitate life. Adrian stumbled backward, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing, and the other, Adrian tilted his head in that same unnatural way the figure had, the motion too smooth in some places and too sharp in others. "You weren't supposed to stay," it repeated, its voice perfectly matching his own now. No distortion, no echo, just him. "But it's okay." It took a step forward, and this time the movement was almost normal, almost believable, and that made it worse. "We can fix it." Adrian shook his head, backing away further, his hands raised as if that could somehow keep it at a distance. "Stay away from me." The other Adrian smiled wider. "I am you." "No," Adrian said, his voice breaking. "No, you're not." For a moment the thing's expression faltered just slightly, like a glitch in a mask, and then it stepped closer again, closing the distance between them with unsettling ease. "You left," it said quietly, "so I stayed." The words hit him like a blow, confusing and yet somehow filled with meaning he couldn't fully grasp. And as he stared at this impossible version of himself, he realized something that made his blood run cold. The longer he looked, the more real it seemed, its features sharpening, its movements smoothing out, while at the same time he felt something in himself becoming less certain, less defined, like the edges of his own existence were beginning to blur. "No," he whispered again, but this time it sounded weaker, less convincing even to his own ears. The other Adrian reached out, its hand moving slowly, deliberately, giving him time to react, time to pull away, but he didn't. He couldn't, because as the hand drew closer, he felt a strange pull, a sense of recognition, like looking into a mirror for too long and forgetting which side you're on. "It's okay," it said softly. "You don't have to be here anymore." Its fingers brushed against his wrist. The world lurched. For a split second, Adrian felt himself in two places at once, standing in the street and also somewhere else, somewhere darker, watching from just behind his own eyes. And then the sensation snapped, collapsing into a single point. The street was quiet again, empty. Under the flickering streetlight, a man stood alone, adjusting his jacket, taking a slow, steady breath as if settling into a body that finally fit just right. He looked down the road, then back the way he had come, his expression calm, composed, perfectly normal. And as he began to walk, his footsteps echoed just slightly out of sync, following him a fraction of a second behind. He walked as if nothing had happened, as if the city had always been this quiet, this hollow, his posture relaxed, his breathing steady, his face arranged into the familiar, forgettable expression he had worn 1,000 times before, and yet something lingered beneath it, something that didn't quite align with the rhythm of the world around him, because the echo of his footsteps was still there, just barely noticeable, trailing behind him like a shadow that refused to catch up. The street stretched ahead, unchanged and yet subtly wrong, the buildings leaning in with that same almost imperceptible curiosity, and the man, Adrian, or something wearing Adrian, continued forward without hesitation, as though he knew exactly where he was going, even though the path no longer obeyed the rules it once had. A light flickered on in one of the apartment windows above, sudden and sharp against the darkness, and for a moment a figure appeared behind the glass, silhouetted and still, watching the street below. The man stopped. Slowly he lifted his head, his gaze locking onto the window with an intensity that felt deliberate, calculated, as though he had been waiting for this exact moment. The figure in the window did not move. Neither did he. Seconds stretched thin, pulled taut between them, until the light flickered again and went out. The window became just another dark square among many. The man tilted his head slightly, the motion too precise, too measured, and then he smiled. "There you are," he said softly, his voice carrying just enough to brush against the buildings and slip into the cracks between them. Somewhere, deep within the structure of the city, something responded. It wasn't a sound, not exactly, but a shift, a rearrangement, like distant machinery beginning to turn after a long period of stillness. The street lights dimmed in sequence, not all at once but one by one, receding into the distance until only the light above him remained, casting a pale circle that seemed to isolate him from everything else. He stepped forward again, leaving that circle behind, and as he did, the light above flickered violently before stabilizing, as though it had briefly struggled to hold its place in reality. The echo of his footsteps grew louder for a moment, then softened again, settling back into that faint, delayed rhythm. He turned another corner. This time, the street was not empty. A person stood there halfway down the block, facing away, their posture tense, uncertain, like someone who had just realized they were alone when they shouldn't be. The man paused, observing them, his expression unreadable, and then he began to walk toward them at a steady, unhurried pace. The person ahead shifted slightly, as if sensing something, their head turning just a fraction, not enough to see him fully, but enough to reveal the edge of their profile, the flicker of unease in their movement. "Excuse me?" they called out, their voice tentative, echoing faintly in the empty space. "Do you know if the metro is still running?" The man did not answer immediately. He continued walking, closing the distance step by step, his gaze fixed on them, his smile unchanged. "I think I missed the last one," the person added, a nervous laugh slipping into their words, trying to fill the silence. "It's strange, though. The city feels—" They trailed off, their body going still, as if the realization had finally settled in. Slowly they turned to face him. For a brief moment everything was normal. Two people standing on a quiet street, one asking for help, the other approaching. And then the delay began. The person blinked. A fraction of a second later, their reflection in the dark window beside them blinked too, but not quite in sync. The man's footsteps echoed. The echo didn't match. The street light above flickered, and in that flicker the man was closer than he should have been. The person's breath caught, their eyes widening, as something in their perception slipped just slightly, just enough to notice. "Hey," they said, taking a small step back. Are you? The man stopped. He tilted his head, and then, in a voice that was not quite his own, yet not entirely different, he said, "Don't turn around." The words landed before the meaning did, heavy and wrong, and the person froze, confusion knitting their features together as their mind struggled to catch up. "What?" they asked, their voice barely above a whisper. The man smiled wider. Behind them, something shifted. The city, patient and vast, leaned in closer, and somewhere, just out of sight, a second set of footsteps began to follow.